Welcome back, and thank you for joining us, Shark's Perspective, the podcast with subject matter experts in marketing. So what are the hottest trends in marketing today, and what are the ones that will affect your future? We hear every year that it's this year's hottest trend or it's that, but are you following a specific trend, or do you have the mindset of a trendsetter who looks at the world just a little bit differently? Rohit Bhargava is the best-selling author of Non-Obvious. He's a professor, a keynote speaker, an entrepreneur, and the founder and chief trend curator for the Non-Obvious company. And on this episode, we'll discuss finding and sticking your own needle in a haystack, creating spectacles, storytelling, having a different mindset for looking at trends, looking at creatives without bias, and everything else that's non-obvious in marketing and advertising. So let's tune in to a trendy curator with a trendy shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Rohit, thank you so much for joining us on A Shark's Perspective today. If you would please tell us a little bit about your background and your career to date.
Sure. Yeah. So I have always been a marketing guy, and I spent many years working in the marketing agency world. And I left about 4 years ago to start my own company called the Non-Obvious Company, and it was all about bringing a new innovation perspective to companies and around a book that I'd published called Non-Obvious, which I now do an annual update to every year.
Well, again, congratulations on yet another outstanding book. I've read them for 3 years now, and I've enjoyed all the Non-Obvious books. You've been doing this for what, 8 years now?
Yeah, it's the last one was the 9th year, so exactly right.
That's
yeah,
awesome.
And it's interesting because there's an update to it every year, and there's new trends every year, and so that's why there's an update.
Well, each one keeps getting better. I know the one for 2019, you've got accolades from Dan Pink as well, and from Ann Handley, and a bunch of other heavy hitters and big timers out there. When did you know that you were on to a series of books? And really, I mean, how much work, how much research do you have to do to put into each one of these together? I know I've seen a visual from one of your presentations where it's a massive stack. You've got a great graphic with you with a million Post-its on it, but I know that's just got to be an overwhelming amount. But getting back to that, when did you know you were onto something?
Yeah, it is a lot of work. But I had early feedback that this was something that people liked, because the first year I did it back in 2011, it was just a blog post, and It was all about the non-obvious trends for the future for the next year. So the horizon was 1 year, and that first blog post with the corresponding presentation was viewed like tens of thousands of times, just people passing it on from one to another. So then I did it again the second year, and then I did it a third year and a fourth year, and each year it was a slightly bigger PowerPoint presentation. But it was only the fifth year that I turned it into a full-length book, and that was the year where it kind of took off. It hit the Wall Street Journal bestseller list, and at that point, I kind of knew that this was something even bigger than just a annual report.
Mm-hmm. Well, how much work, how much research do you have to do to put these together? I mean, this has got to be a mountain of articles and books and websites.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is a lot of work and a lot of research, but it happens throughout the year as well. And so a lot of times what people think when they look at that is, oh man, you're going through all this stuff like all at once. But for me, I've kind of created these habits for myself of continually collecting ideas. So I write a weekly email newsletter where I'm sharing the 5 most interesting stories of the week. And so every week I have to go through a couple hundred stories in order to just figure out what the 5 most interesting were. And so if you add that discipline up every week for an entire year, you can imagine how many stories and how much input you then have to go through. And so I kind of have this moment when I sit down and go through all the research, usually around September of every year, that most of us would probably recognize as being that same moment right when all of your kids, or maybe when you were younger, you would finish and get all your Halloween candy. Sure. And you would spread it all out and start to divide it and sort it up. And say okay, these are the Almond Joys that nobody wants, and these are the Kit Kats that we have to divide up.
Sure.
And you're kind of separating stuff out visually, and that's kind of how I do it with ideas and stories and things that I've ripped out of magazines and all of that. It's sort of a similar moment for me.
So, just as an author, what trends have you seen in that 9-year period? I mean, 9 years ago, Barnes & Noble was just starting to get nervous about Amazon, maybe not to the degree it is now, but just from a promotion, sales, being a best-selling author, from that standpoint, what sort of trends have you seen? It's got to be so
Well, I
different
mean,
promoting a book today.
it's very different promoting a book. It's very different the impact that bookstores have. Um, what's also shifted in many bookstores is how much space they tend to dedicate to
Right.
my category, which is business books,
Right.
as opposed to other types of books. And so the whole bookstore experience has shifted. There used to be more players. Some of them are shut down now. And, a lot of people think all bookstores are dying, but actually independent bookstores have been growing really, really strongly,
Sure.
and people love them. And so there's been really interesting shifts in the industry where, like, the big chain players, obviously only Barnes & Noble really is left.
Right.
But then you've got all these independent bookstores that are creating this really unique experience where they have books, or maybe they're a coffee shop also, and maybe they're like a restaurant too. And so you have all these different pieces coming together to create an amazing experience of a place that people really want to go, which I think is great for not only the publishing industry and for authors, but just like great for our culture too.
Well, let alone whether or not the audience is reading a paper book or a Kindle. Just
Yeah,
that change.
exactly. Yeah, exactly right.
Well, let's go back to the book, The Non-Obvious Books. Describe, if you will, what is the haystack method.
The haystack method is my kind of version of taking a cliche and trying to turn it on its head. So the cliche that we've all heard is finding a needle in a haystack. And a lot of times when you talk about trends, people use the term trend spotting,
Mm-hmm.
and they kind of think that it's a little bit of finding a needle in a haystack. And the haystack method was my way of describing the process that I'm actually going through by collecting all of these ideas, by flipping it around and saying, if you spend enough time gathering ideas, which in this case is the hay, you can take your own needle and stick it in the middle of it and say, this is what the trend is. So you don't have to look for something that you may or may not find hidden and buried. You can actually be empowered to take a needle, stick it in the middle, and say, this is what
Right.
I believe it means.
Well, another thing you bring up throughout the book, of a lot of the different trends, you're seeing things from a different perspective. What do you think sort of has given you that gift? Have you sort of trained yourself to look at things completely different, to find that needle in the haystack? Because a lot of people aren't going to notice it at all. And then you go back and you see a lot of marketers doing the same thing over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think I really benefited from spending most of the early part of my career in the agency world,
Mm-hmm.
because in the same week, while I was at Ogilvy or Leo Burnett, in the same week I might be working on a B2B marketing program for Intel to talk about microchips, or I might be working on a social good campaign around the environment, or I might be helping to sell toothbrushes, or all of that stuff was happening at the same time for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so out of necessity, you kind of become this sort of person that can understand a new industry quickly and learn what you need to know, not to become an expert in that industry, but to become expert enough.
Agreed.
And that type of training, I think, was very valuable for what I do now, which is move across industries and encourage people to think outside of their own particular industry.
Yeah, it's really a gift. So, at least with all the trends that so many people follow, I love this comment that you talk about often in your book. Why are most trends spectacularly useless?
Yeah, and I think anybody who's read predictions of trends close to the end of any year will have experienced this, where people will say the hot new trend for 2019 is social media will continue to rise.
Right.
And you're like, that's not a trend.
Yeah.
That's like a statement of something that exists, right? And a lot of trend predictions like that are either lazy or they're self-serving, right? I mean, if I sell drones, then 2019 is obviously the year where everybody gets a drone
Right.
because that helps me sell more drones, right?
Right.
And that also is misleading. So a big part of what we try and do is offer a fresh, non-obvious perspective that isn't biased, that isn't based on us trying to sell something or promote something.
Well, trends are trending, so this may be the year of trends.
They always have been.
They always have been, yeah. So for at least most of the show, it probably will not surprise you that in your newest book, I jumped to page 97 of the 2019 edition, and that's where the predictions on marketing and social media start. You brought up a great example about a Rocket Lab rocket launch that happened in New Zealand at the first of 2018, and it became noted that it was done as a clever attention getter with a disco ball launched into satellite, put into space, and you call that a strategic spectacle in which more industries than ever will resort to big stunts and engaging experiences than ever in order to attract attention, in order to make a bold statement. And I know you've written about that over time, but elaborate on that, if you will, and why you think that trend will occur, especially in regards to customer experience and how marketers will try to get people's attention.
Yeah, I think that more and more this idea of creating a spectacle has always kind of been something that people did. But what's different now is that it's becoming much more strategic, that they're doing it on purpose. If you think about like Samsung's flagship store now in New York and how they're creating all of these moments for people to experience the products, and they're not even selling the products there. Or you think about like live performances and just the impact of some of these things. I think it is really coming to this sense of the spectacle attracting attention to then use that attention to grow business.
Other than Samsung, did you see any other examples that you came across that really stood out in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I did write about was in the marketing industry. At least, I would go and visit some of my agency friends, and I think it was like around 3:00 every day. Like everybody would run over to their phones because they were all playing this Trivia HQ
Right.
game.
Yeah.
And it was like such a huge phenomenon. And that was a great example, too, because what they were creating was a momentary spectacle where everybody was rushing at that time because they all wanted to play in the moment. And that's just another example, right? Because you would have thought, I mean, a year before that, if I said to you, you could get everyone to log in at 3 p.m. to do something as opposed to wanting everything on demand, you would have said, that's crazy.
Exactly. So, are there any trends that stand out from an advertising standpoint that you're noticing today that are really, just sort of call out that marketers should start planning for?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones that I wrote about specifically when it came to B2B marketing was B2 Beyond marketing. And what I was trying to write about there was this idea that more and more B2B brands are understanding that if they create content and advertising that is just plain interesting for anyone, not only people in their industry, what will happen is people will see that and they'll immediately think, oh, I got to share this with the one person I know in the industry, right? So like when Volvo did the epic split with Jean-Claude Van Damme and balanced him between two trucks that were rolling backwards.
Yeah.
Anyone who saw that, like if you saw that and you knew someone who was a truck driver or who ran procurement for a trucking company, the first thing you would do is take that and send it to them. So they were virtually guaranteeing that that would be seen by 100% of their target audience because it was so interesting that anyone who saw it would immediately pass it on to that person.
Yeah. Or a martial artist like me who could never do that kind of splits.
Hey, maybe one day.
One day. Well, then, so I love how you point out in your books, in each one of them, with each of these, how to use this trend section. And, what advice would you give to marketers, especially on how to engage with flip thinking and also not forgetting the strategy?
Well, I think one of the things that we do tend to do, especially in marketing, is we fall in love with the creative idea, and we forget why we're actually doing it in the first place. And so, one of the biggest discipline elements that is required in order to really get benefit out of this is to not do that so easily, and to think about how we're going to actually generate value and how we're actually going to be able to understand what that value is. I mean, a great example is the use of some of these techniques when it comes to like selling cars, for example. Like it's easy to look at marketing that gets something out there in the world and say, well, okay, equate that marketing to a car sold. Like what car did that sell? And the problem in an industry like that is the job of marketing isn't to sell cars. The job of sales is to sell cars. The job of marketing is to get people to walk into the dealership. And so the right question to ask is, did this marketing that we have engaged in cause more people to walk in the door? Because if more people walked in the door, then you can look at your sales conversion and say, look, of the 100 people that walked in the door, we converted 2 of them to buy a car, so our conversion rate's 2%. If you get 200 people to walk in, we'll sell 4 cars.
Sure.
So the marketing doesn't sell the car. It's the marketing that gets people in the door so the sales can sell the car.
Well, to that same degree, you're giving advice to marketers. I know you also have worked as an adjunct professor at Georgetown, but what kind of advice are you starting to give these younger marketers to start thinking the way guys like you think, the way guys like Seth Godin think, to think out, way outside the box before they get trapped inside, and to think non-obvious?
One of the things that is one of my favorite techniques is to take inspiration from one industry and apply it to an unlikely other industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can all do that to some degree, but we tend to put our tunnel vision blinders on when we're working in an industry and say, okay, I'm only going to pay attention to case studies or examples in this space. And so one of the things I tell younger marketers all the time is try and find a way to be more diversified, to be more well-rounded, to think outside of that industry. Because the thing is, when you're younger and you're starting your career, you can never stand there and say you have as much industry experience as any of the people who are around you who've been there for a long time, because you haven't been in the workforce that long. So you may as well start to own the realm of being the outside thinker, because at least that's something that you could authentically claim.
Couldn't agree more. So, when you speak to a lot of these, I know you speak to a lot of different groups, when you think about businesses and decision makers and entrepreneurs today, what is the most important trend that you tend to point out to them, or is it a mindset of trends that they need to be thinking about every day?
I think that I tend to focus on the mindset more than the individual trend.
Sure.
Because the mindset is what really, you nailed it there. The mindset is what really drives people to see the world a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And it allows them to then say, okay, this is the trend that I'm paying attention to right now, but that may shift over time.
Then, on top of just helping them think that way, how do you help people apply the trends to their business?
Well, yeah, that's a big focus for
Absolutely.
me, particularly because a lot of the trend work you might see is pretty academic, and some of it is
Right.
like way far into the future. It's like, here's what's going to happen in 2025. And people struggle with those things because they're not practical. Whereas as you spotlighted for these trends, like, not only are they shared with lots and lots of research and background, but at the end of every chapter are some stealable ideas, some actionable tips, ways to take the trend and actually put it into action.
So what advice do you have for staying ahead of the next trends? I mean, if I'm starting to think about, if I want to, as a business, think out a 5-year plan and think of your book 5 years from now, how do you sort of figure out a way to stay ahead of all the trends? And to some degree you can't, but you do have to plan, at least in a business role, you do need to plan for the disruptions.
Yeah, I would say my definition of a trend, the way I describe a non-obvious trend, is that it's a curated observation of the accelerating present. And so there's a couple of pieces of that I think are important. That curation, which is like you're pulling out what really matters and what's most impactful.
Right.
It's an observation because you're paying attention to the world. You're being observant. You're not head down in your phone all the time. And it's about the accelerating present. And what that means to me is you're spotlighting and observing something that's happening today. And what you're predicting is that will happen more frequently, or it will impact more people's behavior or more people's beliefs in the future.
Well, then, who are the futurists, the other futurists that inspire you? Who's stellar at being trendworthy that I love how in the book you point out, and quite a few of them, that you point out the other authors and websites, but really, who are the people that inspire Rohit to think differently and be non-obvious?
Yeah, I think that there's quite a few resources for trends that are out there. I personally love Trend Watching, does great work.
Right.
They really spotlight some interesting curated trends in the way that I might describe trend work, which is they're taking the signals of different pieces and they're putting them together and saying, this is what it means.
Sure.
And I think they do a really nice job of that. I think that there are some other platforms that are really great at aggregating trend ideas. So like Trend Hunter, I think, is another one. Or there's other places where like people submit ideas, and it's kind of like an idea factory. And that's useful too, because you get lots of different ideas. It doesn't necessarily tell you what they mean, but it says this is what's happening over here and this is what's happening over there, and then you kind of try and put the pieces together and say, okay, well, this is what it means
Sure.
for our business. And I think what's really exciting to me is teaching people how to see analytically between those things and start to uncover, well, okay, if this is happening over here and something else is happening somewhere else, like what does that mean for me, for my career, or for my business?
Mm-hmm. Rohit, it's that special time in the show. Are you ready for the 5 most interesting questions that you're going to be asked today?
I am ready.
All right, here we go. For somebody that writes books about the future, Nostradamus or one of those magic 8 balls that you used to be able to get at Spencer's Gifts in the mall?
Nostradamus, because it tells you something about how the people of his time were thinking.
There you go. For a man in D.C., the NBA Washington Wizards or the Harlem Globetrotters' arch enemy, the Washington Generals?
The Washington Generals, I guess, because if they're the Globetrotters' arch enemy, they probably do interesting stuff.
There you go. There, that's true. Storyteller or curator?
Storyteller. It's curation is a means to get to something, but stories are what bring it to life.
Trends or predictive analytics?
Trends.
And the most interesting question that you're going to be asked today, Rohit, is biscuits or cornbread?
Cornbread, more flavor.
There you go. So, Rohit, you have written, again, another great book. Where can people find out more about you, purchase the book, follow your thought leadership, social channels, and more?
Most of it is at my full name, so rohitbhargava.com, or that's my name on Twitter as well. Or you can find out about the book at nonobviousbook.com, all one word.
Rohit, thank you so much for joining us on A Shark's Perspective.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So there was my conversation with Rohit Bhargava, the best-selling author of Non-Obvious, a professor, keynote speaker, an entrepreneur, and the founder and chief trend curator for the Non-Obvious Company. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from our conversation with him. First, one of my favorite comments reminded me of something I've spoken about often on several episodes. And I quote, "One of the things we tend to do, especially in marketing, is fall in love with a marketing idea and forget why we're doing it in the first place." I couldn't agree more. And as he further said, you've got to look at how your marketing is going to generate value. For a lot of data-driven marketers, we let the data speak to that. It's often very hard, though, for creatives to let go of their creative ideas. But your audience and the data will support the response and remove bias. Furthermore, it also comes down to what your KPIs are. He brings up a great example of who generates the sale. If you run a car ad, for example, then are you looking at the marketing and saying that was the reason for the sale of the car at the dealership? Or was your marketing actually more responsible for driving traffic to the dealership and then the sales team made the sale? Make sure to define how you generate that value. Second, another piece of great advice he references is to take inspiration from one industry and apply it to another. Look at other types of case studies, and not only those that fit the status quo. And marketers should try to be more well-rounded and more diversified, and be the outside thinker, because at least you can authentically claim that. Third, as he said, one of the most important pieces of advice he gives business leaders and marketers today regarding trends is that the most important trend to focus on is actually not a specific trend itself, but rather having the mindset that really gives people the ability to think about the world differently. He defines a non-obvious trend as a curated observation of the accelerating present. It's about spotlighting something that's happening today and how that will impact behavior in the future. It's been an honor for me to spend this time with you in order to discuss another one of the many components that makes up marketing today. For the rest of your career, I challenge you to look at things in a non-obvious way and be a better marketer by looking at the world just a little bit differently. So join us on the next and every episode of A Shark's Perspective.